So, by way of introducing our reflection on housing issues from the Ligue de Famille perspective, Ligue de Famille in English would translate as the family union. So we are mainly an NGO aimed at defending parents' rights. Let me set as a background a couple of reflection points and thoughts we have in terms of housing that might be relevant for the Belgian case and maybe less urgent than in the French case. In our view, there are three key dimensions that need to be taken on board in this housing crisis to overcome the difficulty. The first key element is the following one. Culturally speaking, we need to get rid of this idea of having a house for the whole life. I'm speaking here for the French-speaking part of Belgium. We desperately need to introduce this idea that there are some family pathways and the emergence of new family patterns with patchwork families, divorced families versus mainstream families force us to think no longer in terms of housing units, but in terms of housing modules. If I had to make analysis of the housing market in the French-speaking part of Belgium, I'm not that aware of the situation in the Flemish part of Belgium, we should not only look at housing shortage, but we should look into the shortage in certain kinds of dwellings, in certain categories of dwellings. Large housing for migrant families and smaller housing units for parents whose children have left their home to live their own lives. So we need to have a much more modular approach of housing. The second key element in my analysis is the aging strand. I have a 24-year-old daughter. She has 50% of chance to live until 100-year-old. And this will raise the question of what kind of accommodation do we need for this aging population? How can we have this togetherness besides private ownership or besides private housing? How to devise a new type of accommodation and dwelling that would foster this togetherness? And this should be part of our future thinking around housing needs. A third key element in my analysis, which once again goes beyond looking at individual units, is how to devise housing policies that would go hand in hand with collective services. So as part of this need for togetherness and as part of the need to ensure the sustainability of dwellings and as part also of the need to provide people with necessary services, how can we have this mix of dwellings plus services plus a sense of living together? This is not theoretical thinking, you know. Here in Brussels, in the north part of the city, and even in the very center part of Brussels, 1,000 new units have been built, and there is no creche, no bakers, no post office, no school at all, which means that there is kind of a compartmentalization between housing units and jobs and services, hence the traffic jams that we see every day here in Brussels. So against this crisis around housing, the time has come to overcome this individual approach to housing, and we should also go beyond some so-called contradictions. There is no need to oppose owner-oriented policies versus tenant-oriented policies. There is no need to oppose private sector-oriented policies versus public sector policies. I was asked to bear witness of the role played by the NGOs as a whole, and more specifically of the role played by my organization. Of course, we are a lobbyist and we try to bear an influence on the policy making, but our first role is to challenge the cultural and economic vision that we have on housing, and the time is ripe, in our view, to rethink the policy making. So this is a challenge not just for policymakers, it's also a challenge for ourselves and our own cultural view on housing. From there, some policies have to be identified, have to be designed. Obviously, there is a major opportunity now in creating jobs in the housing sector, and more specifically by improving the buildings in terms of energy efficiency. At least as far as the French-speaking part of Belgium is concerned, all or most of our buildings are performing pretty poorly in terms of energy efficiency. So this is an economic opportunity that we need to seize, and so we need to engage into a virtuous circle that would foster well-being together with jobs. Because you can delocate a manufacturer in China, it's much more difficult to delocate masonry work. My second concern is the following one. Everything that could foster a better sharing of housing from a fiscal point of view. Sometimes you have too many dwellings or too small dwellings, but with the aging of population, you will end up with an excess in too large dwellings. Therefore, people should be prepared to share their dwellings without being fiscally sanctioned for that. I will not enter into the details of that because it might be a typically Belgian problem, but at least this is a key element that we need to take on board. A last comment, which has more particularly to do with the city of Brussels. In Belgium, the housing crisis boils down to the situation in Brussels. So it is very important for the Brussels Regional Authority to ensure that the middle class doesn't leave the city anymore. The problem is that most people in the middle class can no longer afford having a flat or a dwelling in Brussels. Those young households are now leaving the city. They are moving. They are going either to Flanders or to Wallonia. And this has two major consequences. On the one hand, the Brussels public authority get less income from taxes, and from there they have less means in order to invest in collective housing, and so we are engaging into a vicious circle. And a second consequence, which brings me back to my first reflection, is that again this will generate a lot of traffic jam in Brussels because you have a lot of commuters. The administrative jobs are still in Brussels, but the middle-class people live outside of Brussels and have to commute every day in the morning to come to the city and in the afternoon to go back home. So we really need to identify virtual circles of investment, and this means that the public authorities should have some leeway in order to do that. So what I would call investment margin of maneuver. Thank you for your attention.